My friends, let me begin with a simple but troubling question. What happens when an empire begins to overreach? History tells us Rome, Britain, Spain, no empire lasts forever. And today, we are watching the United States struggle with the same dilemma. The recent Russian show of force in Venezuela is not a small, isolated event. It is a loud signal to Washington that American aggression, its military footprint, and its endless attempts to dominate Latin America may finally have consequences far greater than anticipated. Russia's recent military presence in Venezuela is more than just a passing headline. It is a deliberate act of signaling, a calculated show of force designed to capture Washington's attention and unsettle long-held assumptions about dominance in the Western Hemisphere. To understand its gravity, we must peel back the layers of what this move represents. It is not merely about joint exercises or a few Russian bombers making a high-profile landing on Venezuelan soil. It is about Moscow making a statement. The age of uncontested U.S. influence in Latin America is fading, and a new balance of power is taking shape before our eyes. The question that ought to grip us is this: what happens when a superpower accustomed to calling the shots finds that someone else has stepped into the room with equal determination? For decades, Washington has operated with the comfort of the Monroe Doctrine at its back, treating Latin America as its so-called backyard, a space where outside powers had no legitimate role. That doctrine, though never accepted by Latin American nations themselves, gave the U.S. a justification for interventions, coups, sanctions, and political manipulations across the region. But when Russian aircraft land in Caracas, when Moscow's military advisors walk alongside Venezuelan officers, the myth of the exclusive backyard collapses in front of the world. Russia's decision is a direct challenge to Washington's presumption that it alone dictates the fate of nations in this hemisphere. And that, my friends, is a game changer. The hook here is the irony of history. The very logic that the United States used to defend its global reach is now being turned against it. Washington insists it has the right to station troops in Europe, in Asia, in the Middle East, surrounding Russia and China with bases, alliances, and nuclear umbrellas. But the moment Russia positions itself in Latin America, thousands of miles from Moscow, yet strategically close to the United States, the alarm bells ring in Washington. Why? Because the U.S. is being forced to taste its own medicine. The world is watching the empire encounter a mirror image of its own strategy, and the discomfort in Washington is palpable. We cannot overlook the symbolic power of this Russian move. Venezuela is not chosen by accident. It is a country rich in oil, once courted by U.S. corporations and now battered by sanctions designed to strangle its economy. By standing with Venezuela, Russia is not only projecting military force, but also providing political cover to a government the U.S. has tried to isolate. The message to the world is unmistakable. Russia is willing to shield its allies against U.S. aggression, even in America's traditional zone of influence. That is not just military positioning, that is geopolitical theater designed to shift perceptions of who holds power in the 21st century. Let us add another hook. Imagine the audience this is aimed at. It is not only the United States, it is China, it is Iran, it is every nation watching to see whether the U.S. monopoly on power is finally being broken. Russia's presence in Venezuela tells Beijing that Latin America is open to multipolar partnerships. It tells smaller nations that defying Washington's dictates may not be as suicidal as once thought. And it tells the U.S. public, if they are willing to listen, that their government's obsession with global dominance is provoking responses that make the world more dangerous, not less. Of course, the mainstream media frames this as Russian provocation. But pause and consider the perspective of Moscow. For decades, NATO crept eastward, planting bases closer and closer to Russia's borders, despite promises made after the Cold War. Washington boasts of its ability to project power anywhere on Earth, surrounding rivals with military assets. If the U.S. can plant missiles in Eastern Europe, conduct exercises in the South China Sea, and maintain fleets off Russia's coastline, why should Russia not position itself in Venezuela? The hypocrisy is glaring, and that hypocrisy is precisely why Russia's show of force resonates as more than a stunt. It is a statement of parity. The professional observer cannot ignore the domestic backdrop inside the United States. While Washington fumes over Russia's presence in Venezuela, millions of Americans struggle to pay rent, medical bills, and student loans. Infrastructure crumbles, wages stagnate, inequality soars. Yet the political establishment demands billions more for military budgets, for weapons, for foreign interventions. Here lies another hook. Russia's maneuver exposes the contradictions of U.S. policy. How can a nation that fails to meet the basic needs of its people claim the right to dominate others abroad? How long before ordinary Americans ask whether endless foreign entanglements are worth the risk of global confrontation? Russia's move in Venezuela is therefore not an isolated event. It is a wedge, a reminder, and a warning. It wedges open the space for multipolar power in a hemisphere once thought closed. It reminds Washington that it does not hold absolute authority, no matter how loudly it claims otherwise. And it warns the world that if the U.S. insists on playing the old imperial game, others are ready to play as well, and they may do so in places uncomfortably close to home. This is why the Russian presence in Venezuela is not just another item in the news cycle. It is a turning point, a flashing signal that the geopolitical landscape is shifting. The U.S. may dismiss it, may attempt to downplay it, may even escalate in response. But the reality cannot be ignored. The Western Hemisphere is no longer America's private domain. And Russia has just reminded us all of that fact in the most dramatic way possible. For over a century, the Monroe Doctrine has loomed like a shadow over Latin America, shaping U.S. policy in ways that few Americans fully grasp, but every Latin American nation has felt in its bones. When President James Monroe declared in 1823 that the Western Hemisphere was off limits to European powers, it sounded at first like a defense of independence for newly freed Latin American nations. But very quickly, it became the justification for something far more dangerous: U.S. dominance. That doctrine was not a shield for Latin America. It was a leash used to restrain and control any government that dared to step outside Washington's expectations. Today, Russia's presence in Venezuela tests that very doctrine, pushing it to its breaking point and exposing the hypocrisy of a United States that claims the right to intervene anywhere on Earth, but panics when others do the same in its so-called sphere of influence. The hook here is that the Monroe Doctrine, once the banner of U.S. hegemony, may now be the very rope that tightens around the empire's neck. Let us recall the record. Guatemala in 1954, Chile in 1973, Nicaragua in the 1980s. The U.S. has toppled governments, armed proxy wars, and imposed brutal sanctions across Latin America, always invoking the logic of protecting its backyard. Behind the language of democracy and security lay the raw reality of economic exploitation. Fruit companies, oil conglomerates, mining corporations all benefited from a doctrine that secured markets and resources for U.S. interests. Latin America was not treated as an equal partner, but as a subordinate region to be disciplined whenever necessary. The Monroe Doctrine, in practice, meant that sovereignty in the region was always conditional on U.S. approval. Russia's entry into Venezuela pens this carefully managed narrative. Suddenly, the hemisphere is not a closed system. Suddenly, Washington's doctrine collides with Moscow's defiance. The irony is sharp. For decades, Washington has mocked Russia's insistence on a sphere of influence over its neighbors in Eastern Europe, denouncing it as outdated imperialism. Yet the United States clings to the very same logic in Latin America, insisting that any outside power is an intruder, a threat. So when Russian military aircraft touch down in Caracas, they are not just landing on Venezuelan soil, they are landing on the soft underbelly of U.S. foreign policy, where its contradictions lie in plain view. The hook here is almost theatrical. The doctrine that once symbolized America's uncontested authority is now being used against it, not by theory, but by the unmistakable fact of Russian boots and planes in what was once considered Washington's private preserve. What makes this moment so combustible is the fragility of U.S. prestige. The Monroe Doctrine could only function as long as the U.S. was strong enough to enforce it and others were too weak to challenge it. That balance has shifted. Russia is no longer the post-Soviet state on its knees from the 1990s. It has rebuilt military capacity, leveraged energy exports, and forged partnerships to counter U.S. sanctions. Venezuela, though economically battered, has endured years of U.S. pressure and still stands defiant, finding in Russia not just a partner, but a protector. And behind Russia looms China, watching carefully, investing quietly, and considering whether the doctrine that once excluded all outsiders might now be unraveling in real time. Here is another hook worth considering: the symbolism of geography. For U.S. officials, Latin America has always been close to home, a space where intervention was not just possible but inevitable. But geography cuts both ways. If Washington claims proximity as a reason to dominate Venezuela, why should Russia not claim that same logic for Ukraine or Georgia, nations directly on its border? If U.S. leaders dismiss Moscow's security concerns as illegitimate, why do they expect the world to accept their own? The Monroe Doctrine, meant to simplify Washington's authority in the hemisphere, now complicates it by revealing just how hollow and selective its reasoning truly is. The deeper story here is one of legitimacy. The Monroe Doctrine carried weight in an era when global power was more concentrated, when nations were forced to bow to a handful of empires. But today, the world is multipolar. Nations from Asia, Africa, and Latin America no longer accept the idea that geography alone grants the U.S. the right to control their choices. Russia's challenge in Venezuela is therefore not just about military power. It is about redefining legitimacy in international politics. It signals to the global South that U.S. dominance is not inevitable, that the doctrine which once seemed unshakable can indeed be broken. And we must ask, what happens if the U.S. refuses to let go of this outdated mindset? Will it double down, escalating confrontation to prove that the Monroe Doctrine still has teeth? Or will it accept that history has moved on, that spheres of influence are no longer one-way privileges but contested spaces where others can and will assert themselves? The very survival of the doctrine, and by extension, the credibility of U.S. hegemony, hangs on how Washington responds to this challenge. Russia's move is not just a military gesture. It is a profound test of whether the United States can still enforce the assumptions it has lived by for nearly 2 centuries. Venezuela has become far more than a struggling nation caught in economic crisis. It has emerged as one of the central battlegrounds of 21st century geopolitics, where competing powers test their influence and resolve. For the United States, Venezuela is a thorn it cannot ignore, sitting atop some of the largest proven oil reserves in the world, a strategic location in Latin America, and a government that refuses to bow to Washington's dictates. For Russia, Venezuela is an opportunity, a chance to push back against U.S. aggression, to carve out influence in a region historically denied to outsiders, and to demonstrate that multipolar power is no longer a future vision but a present reality. This clash of interests turns Venezuela into a flashpoint, a place where the struggle for global dominance is no longer theoretical but lived out in real time. The hook here is simple. Venezuela is not just about Venezuela anymore. It is the stage where empires collide. The United States has long pursued a campaign of pressure designed to weaken Caracas and engineer political change. Sanctions have crippled the economy, blocked access to global markets, and deepened humanitarian suffering. Publicly, Washington frames these actions as efforts to restore democracy and defend human rights. But anyone paying attention knows the deeper motivation: control over oil, leverage over a region, and the removal of a government that dares to align with Russia and China. Venezuela represents the uncomfortable reality that the U.S. does not tolerate independence in its so-called backyard if that independence contradicts its corporate or strategic interests. And every new round of sanctions exposes this contradiction further, leaving ordinary Venezuelans to pay the highest price. Russia's involvement changes the dynamic entirely. Where once U.S. pressure campaigns could suffocate smaller states into submission, Venezuela has found lifelines through Russian support, arms deals, joint ventures, diplomatic backing at the United Nations, and now direct military cooperation. Moscow's presence does not erase Venezuela's problems, but it does deny Washington the ability to dictate terms unopposed. In this sense, Venezuela becomes a chessboard where each move carries symbolic weight beyond the borders of the country itself. When Russian bombers land in Caracas, it is not simply about defending President Nicolas Maduro. It is about telling the world that U.S. dominance can be challenged even in Latin America. Here lies another hook. The Venezuelan crisis is no longer a domestic issue or a regional dispute. It has escalated into a theater of global rivalry. Just as Syria became the proving ground for Russia's return to international military influence, Venezuela now stands as a stage for demonstrating how far Moscow is willing to go to counterbalance Washington. The U.S., of course, sees this as intolerable, a direct provocation. Yet the very outrage expressed by American officials only underscores how fragile the old order has become. If a handful of Russian planes can send Washington into a panic, what does that say about the stability of U.S. hegemony in its own hemisphere? The flashpoint also reveals the danger of miscalculation. Venezuela is not just a test of wills between two states. It is a pressure cooker that could explode into confrontation. U.S. covert operations, efforts to back opposition figures, and constant military threats heighten the risk that a standoff could spiral into something far worse. Russia's commitment to defending Caracas makes the possibility of escalation even more dangerous. What happens if Washington tries a military intervention and Moscow decides to respond? What begins as a struggle over oil and politics in Venezuela could quickly drag the world into a confrontation between nuclear powers. The hook for us to recognize here is the volatility. Venezuela is no longer a local crisis. It is a trigger point that could spark something global. Beyond geopolitics, there is also the story of resilience. For years, the U.S. has sought to isolate Venezuela, betting that pressure would force surrender. Yet, despite economic collapse, despite isolation, despite relentless propaganda campaigns, the Venezuelan government still stands, and now stands with the backing of Russia. That survival itself sends a message to other nations under U.S. pressure. Alternatives exist, alliances can be built, resistance is not futile. This is precisely why Washington views Venezuela as such a threat, not because it is a global superpower, but because it demonstrates that U.S. pressure does not always achieve its goals. In a world increasingly skeptical of American dominance, that example is powerful and contagious. Venezuela, then, is not simply a pawn on the board of great powers. It is the square on which the struggle for global order is being contested. Will the U.S. succeed in reasserting dominance, restoring its doctrine of control over Latin America? Or will Russia's support mark the beginning of a new reality where outside powers can and do establish footholds in the hemisphere? That question is why Venezuela is a flashpoint, why every development there reverberates across the globe, and why the stakes could not be higher. It is a small nation carrying the weight of a much larger battle, and in its survival or its collapse, we glimpse the future of global power itself. The shadow of the Cuban Missile Crisis still hangs heavy over the world's memory, a moment when humanity stood closer than ever to nuclear annihilation. For 13 days in 1962, the planet held its breath as the United States and the Soviet Union stared each other down over missiles in Cuba, each side calculating whether the other would blink or push the button. It was a test of nerves, power, and survival. Today, as Russia deepens its presence in Venezuela, that ghost has returned. Once again, the Western Hemisphere is a stage for confrontation between Washington and Moscow, and once again, the stakes go far beyond one small nation. The hook here is chilling history does not simply repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And what we see in Venezuela echoes one of the darkest chapters of the Cold War. In 1962, the crisis was sparked by a simple principle. The U.S. could station missiles all across Europe pointed at Moscow, but when the Soviets attempted the same in Cuba, Washington declared it an existential threat. That logic of double standards remains intact today. The United States surrounds Russia with NATO bases, missile systems, and constant military exercises near its borders, insisting this is defensive. Yet, when Russia positions aircraft or military personnel in Venezuela, thousands of miles from Moscow, but dangerously close to U.S. soil, it is painted as reckless provocation. The hypocrisy is glaring, and it reveals a dangerous truth. The Cuban Missile Crisis never really ended. It just went dormant. Venezuela has awakened it once more. This parallel forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. Has the world learned anything from 1962? Back then, as tense as it was, both Kennedy and Khrushchev eventually recognized the catastrophe that loomed if either pushed too far. They negotiated, compromised, and pulled back from the brink. But today's leaders are not built in the same mold. We live in an era where spectacle often replaces strategy, where political gain at home outweighs global stability, and where brinkmanship is not avoided but embraced. That reality makes the Venezuelan flashpoint far more volatile than Cuba ever was, because it is unfolding in a political climate addicted to escalation rather than de-escalation. The hook worth gripping here is that a single miscalculation could ignite consequences neither side intends. Imagine a U.S. warship intercepting a Russian supply vessel en route to Venezuela. Imagine a skirmish between military advisors on the ground. Imagine a cyber attack blamed on Moscow or Washington, escalating in the fog of mistrust. Any of these sparks could recreate the terrifying momentum of 1962, where events spiral faster than diplomacy can catch up. And this time, nuclear arsenals are larger, weapons are faster, and communication between powers is far weaker than during the Cold War. There is also the psychological dimension. For U.S. officials, the memory of Cuba is burned into the national psyche as a moment of humiliation narrowly avoided. To see Russian power once again assert itself so close to American shores is intolerable. For Russia, however, Venezuela is payback. an opportunity to remind Washington that spheres of influence cut both ways. If the U.S. insists on operating in Ukraine, in Georgia, in the Baltics, then Moscow will remind the world that it too can play near the American homeland. Venezuela becomes not just a partner, but a symbol of Russia's refusal to accept a one-sided order. And here is the most gripping hook, unlike 1962. Today's crisis is unfolding against the backdrop of decline. In 1962, the U.S. was at the height of its power, its economy booming, its global prestige secure. Today, America is weighed down by inequality, crumbling infrastructure, endless wars, and a public increasingly skeptical of foreign adventures. Russia knows this. Its moves in Venezuela are not simply military gambits, but psychological ones designed to test how much resolve remains in an empire already straining under its contradictions. The Cuban Missile Crisis was about confrontation at the peak of strength. The Venezuelan standoff may become a test of confrontation amid weakness. The danger is compounded by the erosion of diplomacy. In the 1960s, despite fierce rivalry, there were channels of communication, diplomats who spoke, leaders who understood the catastrophic risks. Today, treaties have been abandoned, trust has evaporated, and diplomacy has been hollowed out by political posturing. What happens when the world faces another Cuban-style crisis but lacks the statesmanship to resolve it? Venezuela may provide that answer, and it may not be the one we want to hear. The Cuban Missile Crisis taught us that proximity breeds paranoia, and paranoia breeds danger. Venezuela now plays that same role, serving as the site where global rivalries collapse into dangerous intimacy. The lesson of 1962 should have been that such brinkmanship benefits no one and risks everything. But watching Washington and Moscow square off once again in the Western Hemisphere, one wonders if that lesson has been forgotten, or worse, ignored. Venezuela may not yet be Cuba, but the echoes are loud and the risks are real. The world may once again find itself holding its breath, praying that history does not turn its rhyme into a deadly repeat. While Washington projects its outrage over Russia's presence in Venezuela and insists that American power must be defended abroad, the reality at home tells a very different story. Trillions of dollars flow into military budgets, sprawling bases, weapons systems, and endless interventions, yet basic social and economic needs inside the United States remain unmet. Roads and bridges crumble, hospitals struggle, public schools beg for funding, and millions of citizens live without affordable health care. The hook here is striking. A nation that claims it can police the globe cannot even care for its own people, and Russia's bold step in Venezuela shines a spotlight on this contradiction for all the world to see. The United States presents itself as a beacon of democracy and prosperity, but beneath that image lies a society plagued by inequality. The top 1% accumulate staggering wealth, while working families juggle multiple jobs to cover rent and groceries. Student debt chains an entire generation, and healthcare remains tied to profit rather than human need. Yet every year, Congress finds bipartisan agreement to expand defense spending, to pour billions more into fighter jets, nuclear warheads, and overseas operations. Russia's arrival in Venezuela reveals the bankruptcy of these priorities, for if American strength abroad is supposed to secure American well-being at home, why does the gap between rich and poor grow wider with each passing year? Consider the irony. Washington warns of Russian threats thousands of miles away, but the greatest threats to ordinary Americans come from medical bankruptcies, opioid addiction, stagnant wages, and unaffordable housing. None of these problems can be solved by sending aircraft carriers to the Caribbean. None of them require sanctions or proxy wars. Yet these domestic crises are treated as secondary, while foreign policy hawks insist that the survival of the United States depends on pushing back against Moscow in Venezuela. The hook here is a bitter one. Americans are being asked to sacrifice real solutions to their suffering so that elites can continue chasing the illusion of global supremacy. Russia's presence also exposes the fragility of the U.S. claim to legitimacy. A nation that fails to provide health care to millions cannot convincingly lecture others on human rights. A government that ignores the infrastructure needs of its own people cannot claim the moral high ground in demanding reform elsewhere. Venezuela thus becomes a mirror reflecting Washington's internal failures. By showing that America's dominance is not uncontested, Russia forces the world to ask, if the U.S. is so powerful, why are its people so vulnerable? If it can afford to build new military bases abroad, why can't it rebuild the water systems in Flint or the levees in New Orleans? Another hook emerges when we examine the politics of distraction. Leaders in Washington often use foreign crises to divert attention from domestic shortcomings. Escalating tensions in Venezuela allows politicians to posture as defenders of freedom, to rally patriotic sentiment, and to silence criticism of inequality at home. But Russia's involvement changes the narrative. It ensures that the cost of confrontation is no longer theoretical, that escalating abroad risks real consequences with a nuclear rival. This forces Americans to ask whether their leaders are endangering their security abroad while neglecting their security at home. That is not a debate Washington welcomes, but it is one that Russia's move in Venezuela has made unavoidable. The contradiction deepens when we look at the budgetary scale. For a fraction of what the U.S. spends annually on military expenditures, it could provide universal health care, invest in renewable energy, rebuild decaying infrastructure, and lift millions out of poverty. Instead, the logic of empire dictates that resources flow outward into maintaining dominance across continents, oceans, and now into defending against Russian moves in Latin America. Venezuela, in this context, becomes the litmus test. Will America continue to bleed itself dry chasing control abroad, or will it finally recognize that strength comes not from projecting power thousands of miles away, but from building justice and prosperity at home? The hook, perhaps the sharpest of all, is the danger of decline disguised as dominance. Empires throughout history have collapsed not when their armies were defeated abroad, but when their foundations rotted from within. Rome extended its legions while neglecting its citizens. Britain ruled the seas, but could not hold its empire against economic stagnation. The United States today risks repeating that same pattern, boasting of military supremacy, while its people struggle under the weight of inequality and insecurity. Russia's presence in Venezuela may be unsettling to Washington, but it should be far more unsettling to the American public that their leaders prioritize foreign confrontation over domestic survival. Venezuela has therefore become more than a geopolitical dispute. It has become a spotlight illuminating the contradictions of U.S. power. Each Russian aircraft that lands in Caracas does more than challenge America's reach abroad. It asks the American people to confront a truth their leaders would rather hide. Strength is hollow if it cannot serve those who live under it. Dominance is fragile if it comes at the cost of neglecting the very society it claims to protect. The crisis in Venezuela does not just expose U.S. weakness internationally, it forces a reckoning with the failures that grow louder inside America's borders every single day. The story unfolding in Venezuela with Russia's presence is not an isolated maneuver, nor is it a fleeting moment of geopolitical theater. It is, in fact, a clear signpost pointing toward a new world order, one where the dominance of a single superpower is gradually replaced by the interplay of several competing centers of influence. The The United States, for decades, has treated its supremacy as natural, inevitable, almost permanent. Yet history tells us nothing is permanent, and the cracks in the once unshakable edifice of U.S. hegemony are widening with each passing year. The hook we must not miss is this: Venezuela may be the visible battlefield today, but the real story is the accelerating transformation of global power into a multipolar reality. Consider how extraordinary it is that Russia, a country often dismissed in Washington as a declining power, has been able to plant its military and diplomatic footprint in Latin America, right in what U.S. officials still like to call their backyard. A few decades ago, such a move would have been unthinkable without provoking direct confrontation. But today, the response from Washington, though loud and indignant, is also constrained by limits the world did not see during the height of U.S. dominance. Those limits are not just military, they are political, economic, and ideological. The United States can threaten, sanction, and denounce, but the capacity to enforce its will unilaterally is slipping away. That slippage is the essence of multipolarity, when no single nation, not even the most powerful, can dictate outcomes without accounting for the resistance and the alternatives posed by others. This shift is not driven only by Russia. China looms even larger in the global landscape, building infrastructure, financing development, and projecting influence in every continent. Iran, despite relentless U.S. pressure, asserts itself across the Middle East. India, Turkey, and regional players from Africa to Southeast Asia increasingly act independently of Washington's dictates. The pattern is unmistakable. The age of one hegemon has given way to an era of many contenders. The hook here is sharp. When the United States looks at Venezuela, it is not just confronting Russia, it is confronting the uncomfortable reality that the rules of the game have changed. For nations like Venezuela, multipolarity offers both opportunity and danger. Opportunity because no longer must they bend unconditionally to U.S. pressure. They can turn to Moscow, to Beijing, to regional alliances, and play one power against another. Danger because the very competition that gives them leverage also risks turning their country into a proxy battlefield. Yet even in this danger, there is a lesson for the world. Multipolarity is not neat, it is not orderly, but it is inevitable. The voices of smaller nations, long silenced under the weight of empire, begin to find openings in the cracks of unipolarity's decline. The deeper hook lies in how multipolarity exposes contradictions within the United States itself. For years, Washington has proclaimed itself the guardian of global democracy, the stabilizer of world order. But what happens when other powers arrive to stabilize, to defend, to invest, to protect? The very legitimacy of U.S. leadership comes into question. Was it ever about democracy, or was it about dominance? Multipolarity forces that question onto the global stage, and more nations are daring to answer it openly. They see in Russia's boldness in Venezuela a symbolic act that even in the Western Hemisphere, where U.S. influence was supposedly unchallenged, there is now space for alternatives. The implications reach into the American public as well. How long can a society accept the costs of maintaining global supremacy when the returns diminish? When citizens see bridges collapse at home, healthcare systems fail, and inequalities soar, the spectacle of struggling to push Russia out of Latin America begins to feel not only unsustainable, but absurd. Multipolarity does not just rearrange power abroad, it destabilizes the political and economic consensus at home. It asks Americans whether empire is worth the price, and increasingly, the answer is unclear. What Venezuela demonstrates is that multipolarity is not a theory waiting to unfold decades from now. It is already here, shaping events, constraining choices, and challenging narratives. Russia's presence is not the end point, but a marker on the path. China may be next, Other regional powers will follow. The United States can either cling to the crumbling framework of unipolar dominance, or it can face the reality of a multipolar system where negotiation, compromise, and shared influence replace the illusion of control. The hook is undeniable. What we are witnessing in Venezuela today is not just about Caracas, not just about Moscow, not just about Washington. It is about the future of world order itself and whether the U.S. is prepared to live in a world it no longer owns. So I close with this thought. What we are witnessing is not just a geopolitical chess game, it is a turning point in the decline of empire. Will the U.S. double down on aggression, dragging the world closer to confrontation? Or will it finally reckon with the reality of a multipolar world where cooperation, not domination, is the only path forward? If history is any guide, the choice America makes will reverberate far beyond Venezuela, Russia, or Washington. It will determine whether this century is one of shared prosperity or one of dangerous decline.